We're in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of John. John chapter 9. Jesus had made his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. As he was there, he had a couple of run-ins with the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the religious leaders. They were the ones responsible for guarding the law of Moses and for caring for the spiritual life of the nation. And yet they opposed Jesus on every turn. Jesus had dropped a bomb on them in the end of chapter 8. He declared to them that he was God. And you know, that right there really wasn't something they knew how to process. Matter of fact, if you go back to chapter 8, verse 58, right where we had left off, or the verses before that, it says, Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And when Jesus called himself I am, every Jew would know exactly what Jesus was proclaiming. It meant that he was claiming the name of God for himself. And therefore the Jews that were present, in verse 59 it says they took up stones to throw at him. They took up stones. It was blasphemy. And they had the rocks in hand, and they were ready to throw those rocks at Jesus because he had made the claim that he is I am. Now earlier he had made the second of 7 I am statements. He had already told them that he's the bread of life. He says, I am the bread that's come from heaven. And then earlier in chapter 8 he said, I am the light of the world. And as Jesus had mentioned this claim to them, they didn't know how to process it. But what's interesting is you look at this whole passage. One of the things that blows my mind is that when Jesus made the claim that I'm the bread of life, just prior he had fed 5,000 with 7 loaves of bread. 5,000 men plus women and children, up for 10 to 12,000 were present at that feeding. And so he had said, he feeds them and he says, I'm the bread of life. I'm the one who satisfies not just your physical need. I'm able to satisfy your spiritual hunger. And Jesus made that claim. And then he says, I'm the bread of, I'm the light of the world. Matter of fact, go back to verse 12 of chapter 8. Watch what he said. He says, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. That's a huge claim. Matter of fact, it was a claim that Jesus is about to solidify in every one of their hearts, because Jesus is walking out of the temple, and as soon as he walks out of the temple, he finds a man that had been blind from birth. And as he finds this man who had never seen light, who had never known light, he's going to give him light and verify, solidify this claim that he's the light of life. He's the light of the world. He's the one who's able to change the heart. Now, what's interesting about this passage, guys, is that throughout all of the Bible, you can go from the book of Genesis all the way to this point in Jesus' ministry. No one had ever been healed from blindness from birth. Not one. There had been a couple of that have been raised from the dead. But this is the first miracle where someone who was born blind is able to receive sight. And so it becomes one of the significant events in the scriptures. What's also interesting is that in the Old Testament, one of the markers for the Messiah, or one of the indicators that someone is the Messiah, is that he would be able to give sight to the blind. No one had ever done that up until that point. It was unheard of for someone to give sight to the blind. Matter of fact, it's in Matthew chapter 11 when Jesus was doing his miracles. One of John's disciples said, "Are you the Messiah or are you not the Messiah?" John sent us. He wants to know. And he says, "Go back and tell John the blind see and the lame walk." The first thing he mentions, look, tell John the blind are able to see. And that was to be an indication that the Messiah was on the scene. It would be in the book of Isaiah, and I love this passage in Isaiah in chapter 35 in verse 4. It says this, "Say to those who are fearful-hearted, be strong and do not fear. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you." Watch this. "Then the eyes of the blind shall be open, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing. For water shall burst forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert." You see, the Old Testament said when this one comes that's able to bring sight to the blind, you're going to know that's him. And here we find ourselves in chapter 9. Jesus is claiming to be the light of the world. And then as you notice this passage here, it tells us in verse 1 of chapter 9, Jesus passed by. He saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And so we're introduced right away. Jesus walks out of the temple where he had been teaching, where he had been having this conversation with the Pharisees. And as he's walking out of the temple, somewhere along the path, there's a blind man. Jesus takes notice of him. And the disciples, noticing Jesus taking notice of him, they begin to go, "Jesus, tell us about the blindness. Why is this man born blind? Did his parents sin? Did he sin? How did this come to be?" Now, whenever you're looking at a passage like this, and we'll see by the time we get to the end of chapter 9, that Jesus is going to parallel something here. Just like he did with the bread that there's a physical hunger and then there's a spiritual hunger. He's going to parallel here. There's a physical blindness and there's a spiritual blindness. And he's going to show us that this spiritual blindness is something that all of us have to come to terms with. We're all born blind, spiritually. And Jesus is going to take this blind man to illustrate this spiritual truth. And if you go back with me to Isaiah chapter 59, the whole chapter is an incredible chapter, but I want you to focus in verse 8. Because there in Isaiah 59:8, watch how the prophet Isaiah makes that same declaration. Watch what he says. "The way of peace they have not known, and there is no justice in their ways. They have made themselves crooked paths. Whoever takes that way shall not know peace. Therefore, justice is far," check this out, "from us." Isaiah is including himself in this, the prophet, right? "And all the nation of Israel. Therefore, justice is far from us, nor does righteousness overtake us. We look for light, but there is darkness, for brightness, but we walk in blackness. We grope for the wall like the blind, and we grope as if we had no eyes. We stumble at noonday as twilight. We are as dead men in desolate places." This is what Isaiah says. Look, we're blind. We're all in the same boat together. We're going down a crooked path and we're just groping through life, just trying to find our way, trying to find right and truth and righteousness. And what Jesus is going to proclaim in this passage is that we're all in the same boat. All of us are heading the same path. Until you come to the light, you're going to be in darkness. And that light is Jesus Christ. He says, "I'm the light of the world." And as he sees this blind man there, his disciples, come along. They come along, Jesus, and they go, "Jesus, we have a question from you. This man, born blind, why?" And the Jews believed that if someone had an ailment from birth, there was something that they had done or something their parents had done to cause that. And so they asked Jesus, hey, imagine how cool it would be just to walk with Jesus and begin to ask him all the questions you have. Like, Jesus, where did Cain get his wife? I mean, just the profound questions of life, right? Just be able to hang out with Jesus. And he drops this question on Jesus. Why? Why this man? Why his suffering? Why his pain? Why his blindness? And I think it's the age-old question that, everyone comes across at some point in your life. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is someone who's innocent have to suffer some kind of, debility or some kind of struggle or some kind of, battle that, it doesn't seem fair, it doesn't seem right? And Jesus is going to answer their question very simply there in verse 3. He says, neither this man nor his parents have sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. And I love that Jesus says, look, this isn't about sin of the parents. It's not the sin of the person. That God's works are going to go forth. God is going to accomplish what he intended to accomplish in the middle of all of it. Now, guys, here's the deal. I think as a parent, we can oftentimes kind of have some kind of guilt or some kind of shame, or we kind of feel like, well, if my kid who knew the Lord, who walked with the Lord, grew up in a godly home, and then they walk away from God, somehow it's my fault. It's never the case. You see, every one of us will stand before God and give an account for our own life. And so you've raised your kids, in truth. You followed, to the best of your ability to instruct them and pour into them. You know what? They're going to have to stand before God. And everyone who's, in that position, you as a parent, it's really easy to just kind of feel like, man, I failed, I faltered, I must have done something to cause them to, to walk away. And you realize that, everyone has the choices of their own life. And so Jesus says, it's not the parents' fault. Your actions are going to, now that's not to say that you can't have influence on your children, because you do. But it's not your weight to carry for the rest of your life because of their, rebellion against God. It's also interesting here that he says, look, it's not even his own fault. Now, what does that mean? It means that, guys, we're in a broken world. It's because of sin that sickness has entered the world. It's because of sin that we're battling with viruses in our world. Now, man can manipulate some of this stuff, and it seems like that may be what's going on. But you see, the reason is because we're in a broken, fallen world. Matter of fact, Romans chapter 5 in the 12th verse, it says this, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men, because all sinned. Very contagious. Sin is. Everyone gets it. It's spread to all men. And therefore, all guilty before God, all sinners before God. And what's incredible is that as he, mentions this picture here, he says, look, who did this? He goes, look, neither one did it. But let me tell you something. The works of God are going to be manifested as a result of it. And there's only a certain amount of time that I'm going to be in the world. And he says, the night is coming that no one can work. And I think there's, Jesus knowing I'm down to, 6 months before my departure. Everyone there, kind of in tune with what's going on. As far as Jesus is in tune with what's going on. And he says, look, we got a window here, guys. For 6 months I have left while I'm here on earth. And I think what a great reminder for you and me that, as long as you and I are here, we have the opportunity to work, to do the things that God has called us to do. Once you leave here, you're not going to have any effect here, right? And I think it's important to keep that in mind. We should number our days. We should know that, I have the window of opportunity. It's now. It's before me. And one day that window is going to close, and that opportunity will be gone. And Jesus very aware of that. Now, watch what Jesus says in verse 5. He brings back something he had mentioned in chapter 8. He says, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. He brings back the topic that started the whole controversy in chapter 8. And he says, I want you guys to understand something. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the one who produces the light that this world needs. Now, Jesus at this moment turns to the blind man. And I want you to pick it up in there in verse 6. He says, and when he had said these things, he spat on the ground, he made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and he washed and he came back seeing. What just two verses there that you know so much questions come up. Jesus spat on the ground. And I don't know about you, I'm visual. I'm trying to think this through. Wait a second. Jesus kind of bends over and he spits. And it could, you kind of like, that wasn't just one spit. You can't make clay with one spit. This was a couple of accumulated. And from the dirt, he begins to, knead it together. And from it, he makes clay out of it, it says. And then he takes the spit clay, saliva clay, whatever you want to call it, and he just kind of rubs it on his eyeballs. And I read this, I'm like, why did Jesus choose to do it this way? But if you go back to another passage, and I think it's in Luke's account, that he walked up to a guy and it says Jesus just spit in his eyes and he healed him. I don't know. I think we should have spit healing contests. Ceremonies or something. I don't know. Just, he would just, walk up and then he stuck his finger in another guy's ear and then he touched his tongue. And he never did it the same way twice. And it's incredible because Jesus goes and he tells this guy with the mud on his eyes, says, now I want you to walk. He's blind, right? He walks 3/4 of a mile down to the pool of Siloam. And he gets there, I assume someone's kind of, guided him to the pool of Siloam. We have no idea how this plays out. And the guy goes down, he takes the water, he kind of washes out the mud that was in his eye, the clay that was in his eye, and then all of a sudden he sees. And I'll guarantee you this was a big deal. This isn't kind of like, I guess I got my sight. And that's not what happened. He's washing. And he's there by the water, and I can only imagine he saw the reflection of his own face for the very first time. Looks up and he sees the sky and he sees the sun and he sees the trees and he sees people, the surroundings of what's going on around him for the very first time. And I guarantee you he wasn't going, okay, now what? This guy was dancing. This guy's like, I never, ever, his whole life, born blind, all the way till, the present time, for the first time, he's able to see. Because I don't know about you, I can remember the day I got saved. I can remember the day that my eyes were open on the spiritual realm, and I remember it felt like life had just changed, something had just happened. I remember asking Jesus to come into my heart, to wash me from my sins, to just take this wretched life that I was living and to transform it. And I'll tell you, from that moment forward, man, I always knew there's something different about my life now. I see things differently. I perceive things differently because Jesus Christ has come into my life. And there's a spiritual parallel that we're going to be looking at through this passage. And if you've ever been born again, if you've ever had the scales removed from your eyes on a spiritual level, you understand exactly what that means. Because something changed that day. And for this man, it changed, and everyone around him knew that it changed. It wasn't kind of like, well, there's that guy, he's still begging anymore. No, he wasn't, his life transformed. No, watch what happens. Watch this. All of a sudden he comes back, he's seen. Look at verse 8. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? And some said, "This is he." And others said, "He is like him." And he said, "I am he." You kind of see the progression. All his friends go, "Is that the same guy? Is that the same guy?" They go, "No, the guy just kind of looks like him." He goes, "No, it's me. It's me. I was the blind guy. I was the beggar. I was the guy that was every day waiting for someone to hand me a piece of bread because I didn't have any ability to do anything for myself at that point." He says, "I'm him. I'm the guy." Now, watch this. Therefore they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" And he answered and he said, "A man called Jesus made clay. He anointed my eyes. And he said to me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash.' So I went and I washed and I received sight." And they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know. I was blind." No, he doesn't say that. He just says, "I don't know." Right? And what's incredible, what a picture. They go, "Well, how did this happen? I mean, you were blind from birth. Did you have some accident? Did you hit your head? What's the deal? How did you get your sight back?" He goes, "No, this man by the name of Jesus." And at this point, he calls Jesus a man. And you're going to see a progression, guys, as this guy, discovers who Jesus is. All he knows right now is this man, his name is Jesus, and he made some clay out of his saliva. He anointed my eyes with that clay, and all of a sudden, he told me to go. And I went, man. And I think it's a picture of faith right here. Faith is when you hear what God tells you need to do to fix your blindness. You're willing to say, "God, I'll do whatever you tell me to do because you acknowledge that I was blind and I know I need to see. So God, you tell me what is the remedy for my blindness." And when you find out the remedy for your blindness, faith acts upon the remedy for blindness. And this man did just that. He knew what the remedy for the blindness was. He walks to the pool, just 3/4 of a mile away. He dips into the pool, throwing water on his face, cleans it out, and his sight was there. And he's testifying now of what God had done for his life. And when God comes into your life, I tell you, the first thing you want to do is you want to tell somebody else because you know what blindness is like. And you want others to know, man, that there's a God who's able to fix blindness. And it becomes something that you can't just contain or just kind of hide or just kind of like, "Well, I'm glad it worked for me." No, it's like, man, I want everyone to know that blindness is a real thing and that there's someone who can heal a blind man. And he wasn't shy about it. He wasn't reserved about it. He was going to tell everybody. Verse 13, notice what happens here in verse 13. It says, "And the Pharisees, they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees." Now, we don't know the motive for bringing him to the Pharisees. It could have been that they're thinking, the people are going, "Man, once the Pharisees see that a blind man from birth has found sight, then the Pharisees are going to acknowledge that he's the Messiah." That could have been the motivation for doing that. Or it could have been that they were going to say, "Well, we want to prove this. We want to make sure that this blind guy, isn't pulling something over our eyes. And so we want the Pharisees to validate or to verify that this blind man is now, able to see." And so they take him to the Pharisees. And as they bring him before the Pharisees, we get one piece of information in verse 14. It was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and he opened his eyes. The Sabbath. You remember the last miracle Jesus did on the Sabbath? They wanted to stone him again. And Jesus did it on the Sabbath. And I'm convinced that Jesus did it intentionally on the Sabbath. He could have done it on Friday. He could have did it on Monday. He did it on the Sabbath because he was trying to undo this religious grip that the Pharisees had upon the nation. And so he does it right on the Sabbath day. And he would have broken 3 commandments, according to the Pharisees, by healing on the Sabbath. He made mud. He made clay, which would have been kneading the clay, would have been considered work. healing somebody on the Sabbath. It was okay if you're saving someone's life to save their life on the Sabbath, but if it was anything outside of just keeping them alive till the next day, it was forbidden. It was considered work. And so if someone's bleeding out, you can you can tie a rope. But you can't do anything to heal them on that day. And Jesus healed the blind man on the Sabbath. And then he instructed he instructed the blind man to walk beyond what the law permitted them to walk. It was considered work. And so Jesus was guilty of 3 different violations of the law according to the Pharisees. And it's in this picture that it says, and John wants us to know, it was the Sabbath when he opened this guy's eyes. And the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay in my eyes, I washed, and I see. Don't you love how he shortened his story? I'm just going to give you the facts, man. Here's the nitty gritty. Here's the bare bones. Look, I was blind. He put clay on my eyes. I washed. I see. Now, he had no regard for who he was talking to. Remember, he was a blind man. I imagine the blind man for the very first time has seen Pharisees. They're in their robes. They got their all of their garments and their colors and their phylacteries. I mean, they're outward looking so spiritual. And this guy's like, let me tell you. Let me give you the facts. I washed my eyes. I see. And the Pharisees are beside themselves. They don't know what to do with this man. I mean, watch this. Look at verse 16. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And others said, how can a man who's a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. Did you guys track with that? Notice what's happening. Some of them are going, how can a man of God work on the Sabbath? He can't be from God. He's got to be from the other team. He's got to be the devil. It's got to be someone else. It can't be God. And they're going, well, wait a second. Only God can bring sight to a blind man. And because of the 2 camps, they were divided over who did the miracle and how the miracle transpired. Now, they, the Pharisees, said to the blind man again, what do you say about him? Because he opened your eyes. And he said, he's a prophet. Notice where this guy's going. He went from, he's a man by the name of Jesus to now he's a prophet. A prophet is someone sent by God. And as the Pharisees are questioning who Jesus is, his faith is growing. As he's learning more and thinking through just like what just happened, he's realizing, you know what, this had to be God. A man couldn't do what Jesus just did. He has to at least be a prophet. And so his faith is the more he's considering these things, the more he's understanding of who Jesus is. And his faith is growing stronger. Watch this. Look at verse 18. And the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind, and they received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. Now, there's going to be 3 interrogations. One's going to be the blind man, then he's going to call the parents, and then they're going to call the blind man again, okay? So there's 3 separate interrogations of this miracle. The blind man's on the scene, right? And they said, how did this happen? I told you how it happened. I mean, I was blind, I see, I told me to wash, he put the clay, it's simple. They go, we don't believe you were blind. I think you had your sight the whole time. We want to talk to your parents. So they get the parents. The parents come in. And the parents are now going to be interrogated. And they ask the parents, watch this. They ask them saying, verse 19, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered and he said, we know that this is our son. We know that he was born blind, but By what means he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age. Ask him. He will speak for himself. And his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was the Christ, that Jesus was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Notice what happens here. The parents come in. And they begin like, okay, we want to know, is this your son? And then if this is your son, how did he get his sight back? Did you guys take him to doctors? Was there some surgery? Was there, someone else that we can give this credit to or give this the praise to for doing such an act? And the parents said, look, we're going to tell you what we know. We know that this is our son. We know that he was born blind, and we know that he can see now. That's all we got for you. And they were afraid, because the Jews had already said, if someone confesses that Jesus is the Christ, and if you would have said that he healed the blind man, you're acknowledging that he's the Messiah. And they were afraid that if they did so, they would get kicked out of the synagogue. Guys, cancel culture has been around for 2,000 years. You identify with Jesus, your whole life was going to be turned upside down. Because if you get kicked out of the synagogue, that meant that you were going to be, ostracized from your family. You're going to ostracize from your friends. If you worked for a Hebrew, for a Jewish man, you were going to lose your job. Your parents would kick you out of the house if you were still in their house. You see, it would have been a big deal. A big deal. And you got to wonder how what that's looking like in our culture right now. Because if you profess to be a born-again Christian, then there's something that, you now walk around with a little scar on you as far as this world's concerned. They look at you a little bit different because you declare that this book is truth. And this book doesn't line up with their lifestyle or their culture or their perception of things. And so therefore, there's going to be this whole kind of divide that's going to take place. And here the parents are going, look, we don't want no problems. We don't want to do anything that's going to upset anybody. We're just going to tell you this. Here's the facts. We know that he knows our son. We know that he was blind, and we know that he can see. That's all we know. Because they feared getting kicked out of the synagogue. But look at this, man. I love this. They called the man who was blind again. And they said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered and he said, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Isn't that great? Because I don't have all the theological answers for you, buddy. But I can tell you what I do know. I know I was blind, and I know I can see. Isn't that encouraging? Maybe you're a baby Christian or someone who feels like, man, I don't have all the answers, that every time I talk to somebody, I don't have all... Look, you don't have to have all the answers. He's talking to the Pharisees. This guy had sight for like 3 hours. And he didn't have to argue the theological points because I don't know if he's a sinner. I don't know what's going on. All I know is that I was in darkness and now I have light. And every one of us have that testimony that have come to faith in Jesus Christ. Look, I used to be in darkness. I used to live a life of rebellion against God. And he came and he opened up my eyes. And now I can see. And I'm living a different life now. I'm not perfect. I'm still on this journey of trying to learn about my walk with God and grow in this walk with God. But I know I can attest to this. I was blind, but now I see. And every one of us that have come to faith in Jesus Christ can make that same claim. I was blind, but now I see. And this guy, he's going up against the theological giants, and he just says, "Look, I don't know what to tell you guys except the fact that I was blind and now I see." Look at verse 26. I love this. I love what he does. He says, and they said to him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered them, I told you already, and you don't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become one of his disciples? I can just hear everyone in the room, ooh. That was a good blow. He goes, hey, we've already gone over this. Are you asking because you want to know? Are you asking because you want to become a disciple? And what he was proclaiming at that very moment is, look, let me tell you something. I'm his disciple. Do you also want to become his disciple? Because I know this. I like what he does. I don't like what you guys are doing. I like what Jesus does. I'm not sure I'm all up for this religious stuff here. And it's an incredible picture because now he says, verse 28, they reviled him. And they said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he's from. And the men answered, and he said to them, why? This is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he's from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone's a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Man, this guy's a spiritual giant already, isn't he? He's teaching the Pharisees. He's giving them a lesson in theology. He said, let me tell you guys something. We know that from the beginning of time, no one has ever been able to be healed from blindness. And here I am, a blind man that can see. How many fingers am I holding up? Right? I mean, I'm sure he's wanting to prove, right? Who just did this? And if a man is a sinner, God's not going to hear his prayer. But if this man is with God, then God's going to answer his prayer. And he goes, it's very simple. You guys, don't even get the simple stuff. It's almost as though he's talking on a theological basis, saying 2 + 2 = 4. And he's telling that to the Pharisees. And trust me, the Pharisees at this point are beside themselves. Watch what happens. They answered and they said to him, you were completely born in sins and you're teaching us. And they cast him out. I love the picture. You were a sinner, born in sin. You had blindness your whole life. And you're going to come and try to tell us who God is with and who God's not. And they threw him out of the synagogue. They excommunicated him. What the parents were afraid of, he didn't care. And then verse 35 happens, man. And this here, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when Jesus had found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? And the blind man answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said, you have both seen him, and it is he who's talking with you. And then he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Guys, he went from calling him a man to a prophet to the Son of God. And this short span. This man grew spiritually more than the Pharisees had grown their whole life in a few hours. And he had come to this realization is he finds Jesus. Jesus comes to him and says, do you believe in the Son of God? And he's there like, now, think about what's happened. He hadn't seen Jesus yet. He had never laid eyes on him. The last time he saw Jesus had put mud in his eyes and told him, go for the journey to the pool of Siloam. And now he comes back into Jesus' presence, and immediately he knows who he's talking to, because when someone has the inability to see, now the rest of their senses become more sensitive. And I guarantee you, he heard his voice and he knew exactly who he was talking to, even though he had never seen him before. And as he hears his voice, he turns to him at that point and he says, you believe that in the Son of God? And he said, who is the Son of God? And you tell me and I'll believe in him. And Jesus says, look, you've seen him and you're talking to him. And what Jesus just proclaimed to this blind man is that he's the Son of God. And immediately he says, Lord, I believe. And check this out, guys. He worshiped him. And what that is another declaration of Jesus' deity. Anytime in the Bible that someone attempts to give worship to anything, that person refuses it. Remember when the angel, it says that John, the beloved, falls down and he tries to worship the angel, and John says, don't worship me, worship God. When Paul the apostle had went into a city and he had done a miracle, a man that had been lame started walking, and they all wanted to worship Paul. Paul tore his clothes and he says, look, I'm a man just like you guys. Don't worship me, worship God. But in this instance, you know what's amazing? The man worships Jesus, and Jesus does not correct him or rebuke him or direct the worship somewhere else. He receives the worship of the blind man, or the former blind man. Another declaration that Jesus is deserving of worship, and only God is deserving of worship. Therefore, Jesus is God. And he, in this instance, tells this blind man that he is now not only not blind physically, but he's not blind spiritually, because his eyes had been opened on two planes, not just on one. And then the verse 39, the lesson comes to a head as Jesus explains, and Jesus said, for judgment I've come into the world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. And what Jesus is declaring, this blindness that he's talking about, isn't just a physical blindness, it's a spiritual one. That a man could be, brought up with perfect sight. You can have 20/20. You can have 20/10. You can see things that no one else on the physical level could see. But let me tell you something. That doesn't mean that you can see spiritually. And when Jesus declares this, he says, look, I came into the world to judge, to separate, to divide. And then he says, those who may see and those who will not see. Those who are made blind. That's the division. Those who were blind but can see, and those that are thinks they can see, but now they're blind. They were made blind as a result of it. And the lesson that Jesus is telling and he's giving is that any person could live this life and they can go through their whole life and they can still be blind. You can be religious, you can go to church, you can have, been brought up in a Christian home, but, brought up in a Jewish home, in a religious home, and you can still be living your life in blindness. And if you don't receive this truth, that Jesus is the only one who can illuminate for you truth and right and good and righteousness, then you're going to continue down this road of blindness. And the Pharisees understood that Jesus was saying that, because watch what they said. And verse 40, and some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words, and they said to him, are we blind also? Jesus, are you saying we're blind? That's what they're asking. Are you calling us blind? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. Notice what Jesus is saying. You will never acknowledge your blindness. You claim that you have 20/20 vision when it comes to spiritual things, and the reality is you don't. And because you'll never acknowledge that blindness, you'll never be healed from that blindness. And I can tell you, man, there's a lot of people living in the United States of America who think they can see, but they're blind. Are you a Christian? Of course I'm a Christian. I'm an American, ain't I? That's not what makes you a Christian. Are you a Christian? Well, I'm a good person. That's not what makes you a Christian. That's not what saves you. You can walk through this life and you can be blind. Brought up in a wholesome environment, and you can be blind. Jesus had given that same parable in the Gospel of Luke, and I think the same lesson that he was teaching in Luke, and I think in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, let me ask you to turn there. We'll tie it all together here and conclude our time together there in Luke chapter 18. Look at verse 9. And Jesus spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Guys, Jesus used this illustration, this parable, and he took people from both ends of the spectrum. A Pharisee, the one who was perceived to be righteous, a tax collector. That was like the lowest you can go when it came to the Jews' perception of things. You were a tax collector. You were a traitor. And Jesus uses the two extremes. It's like the far left and the far right in our culture. Those that are just, way out there on one end, and those that are way out there on the other end. And Jesus says they both went to the temple and they both went to pray. And the Pharisee prayed. Watch this. Verse 11. The Pharisee stood, they prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, an extortioner, unjust, an adulterer, or even as this tax collector. The piousness of the Pharisee praying a prayer like, God, thank you so much. You've made me such an awesome person. Watch what he says. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. He was bragging about his own spiritual accomplishments. And he's like, I'm somebody. I deserve God's favor. And then it says, the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast. And he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. You see, Jesus just taught a parable of a blind man who knew he was blind. And a Pharisee who did not even have the inclination that he could be blind. And he says, let me tell you something. There's a vast difference between the two. The one who acknowledges his blindness will seek out help so that the light of the world can come and shine in that person's life, and they can be changed and transformed by the light of the world. But if someone thinks that they see while they're blind, they'll never seek out, acknowledge that they have a need. In the kingdom of heaven, guys, is the same illustration. The only way you can get there is acknowledge that you're blind. The only way that you can be made right with God is if you acknowledge, I am lost. What the things that I hold to be true, aren't always true. That, God is the one who establishes truth, and anything I say that contradicts God is wrong. And I bring myself under His authority and under His rule and say, God, you are the light of the world. And Jesus is the light of the world. And it's not until you acknowledge that you're blind and that you need a Savior that you can ever find that light. It's not until you humble yourself. Just like the passage there in Luke 18. Until you humble yourself, you will never acknowledge your need. And I love as Jesus is making the claim. Next week we get into John chapter 10. I'm going to encourage you, read ahead. But Jesus in John chapter 10, he's going to make two claims, the two I ams. I am the door and I am the good shepherd. And when he says, I am the door, what he's declaring is that there's only one way to get into heaven. Jesus will make that claim on multiple occasions. In John chapter 14, he'll say, I am the way, the truth, and life, and no man comes to the Father except through me. Here in John chapter 10, he's going to say, look, I'm the one who sits at the door, and there's no way to get into the sheepfold unless you go through me. He's the door. He's the door. He's the light. He's the bread of life. And until you acknowledge your hunger, until you acknowledge your blindness, you can never be a partaker in it. Because you'll never ask. And if this morning, man, you realize, you know what, I've never asked. I've never invited Jesus Christ to illuminate to me who He is. I never asked Him to satisfy my hunger when it comes to spiritual things. And today, man, you know that it's time to surrender your heart to Jesus Christ. I'm going to invite you this morning to take that step, to make that decision, to finally say, God, I give. It's not about what my mom and dad said or what they did or how they brought me. This is between me and you, God. I am blind and I need you to awaken me.